Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk a little bit about the periodic table of elements. A very weird starting point, I'm aware, but I do have a connecting thread that I also kinda hate myself for. Effectively dating back to 1869, with Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev, the periodic table is both an organizational chart that lists all of the known elements, and it's also a sort of predictive tool that can be referenced to understand the potential traits of still unknown elements. Now, I'm no scientist, and I'm certainly not going to go in depth about everything about the periodic table, so instead I'm going to talk about some of my favorite elements on the table. I do have several contenders that I can think of off the top of my head. Tungsten is pretty neat because it's really heavy, and it's also known as wolfram. Bismuth is really cool because of the bizarre shapes that it forms, along with the rainbow coloration of it. And lithium is cool because it'll explode with water, and it's also the name of a Nirvana song. But my absolute favorite is the element of surprise. Listen, I'm sorry, alright, but let's roll with it, because today we're talking about surprise attacks. In World War II, there was probably no other country that was associated more with the idea of surprise attacks than Japan. While traps and sort of hidden soldiers and the like were used by all in the war for various reasons in a variety of ways, Japan is perhaps most well associated with the idea because of Pearl Harbor primarily, along with things like Japanese snipers hiding in trees, banzai charges, and the tunnel systems that would snake and weave across entire islands. The middle two strategies would work quite well for the Japanese military, or at least well for their ideology, since their soldiers would seldom surrender and would rather be killed than captured. So soldiers that were hidden in the trees would be able to take out several Allied soldiers before being found out and inevitably taken out himself, as he had very little to no protection up there in that tree. And the banzai charge participants can sort of go out in a blaze of glory, in the hopes of taking out a few soldiers along the way. Basically, at least part of the reason why surprise attacks worked well for Japan is that dying in battle was considered a great honor, not a loss. So, in the world of aviation, how exactly do you conduct the best possible surprise attack? Pearl Harbor was certainly an effective surprise attack, with the Japanese catching America completely off guard, but there certainly was room for improvement. Japanese carriers just chugging across the Pacific were right there out in the open, nary a bit of cover or camouflage. While they weren't spotted until it was far too late for America, them being out in the open for so long means that it wasn't the best possible surprise attack. Instead, if the ship that was carrying the planes could itself be concealed from sight, one way or another, then the surprise factor would be much greater. It would be as if this boat and these planes just appeared from thin air and attacked, only then to just vanish. And surprisingly enough, Japan was actually doing something like this in World War II, and before the war ended, they had built, tested, and sent out for combat one of the truest surprise attack planes of World War II. This is an attack plane that was flung from the seas. This is the Aichi M6A Seiran. To begin, we have to go back a few decades to around World War I, where many a country were beginning to investigate the concept of a submarine that was carrying aircraft. Keep in mind, we're talking even before aircraft carriers themselves exist. Countries were already thinking about the possibility of making underwater aircraft carriers. While the whole concept early on could be a video all on its own, to put it quite simply, the concept early on in the 1910s, 20s, and early 30s generally garnered rather little attention and success. In these early tests, the plan for the plane on board the submarine was almost always to be a reconnaissance plane. For most submarines, a singular plane would be kept on board to be launched at some point to scout the waters ahead, and to hopefully then return back to the submarine. Again, while most major countries invested some amount of time and resources into the concept, only two countries ever really got the concept to a usable state. Both of them were Axis countries in Germany and Japan. Germany would less use airplanes and more helicopters or rotor kites like the FA-330, which was basically just a rotor with a seat attached that would be connected to a U-boat via a tow line, and it flying high above the U-boat would allow the sub to have far greater vision all around. The problem with these, though, which is probably why it was seldom used, was that if danger was spotted, the kite had to be pulled back into the sub first before the sub could go underwater, which simply took too much time. Germany did also plan to create larger submarines that could carry a single float plane, but that plan would never come to fruition. Japan, on the other hand, took the general concept much more seriously, and they would develop several submarine-based planes and several large submarines from which to hold said planes. Their interest in this project seemed to be far greater than any other country, and given the general makeup of the Japanese military, navy, and battlefield, it certainly isn't hard to see why. Japan envisioned expanding out into the waters and islands of the Pacific, and also attacking American targets across the globe. To do these things, having a strong and versatile navy was vital. So initially, for Japan's B-1 class of submarines, they would stick to the more prevalent idea for a sub-based plane, and they would call for a new reconnaissance aircraft. While on a normal recon plane, the more focused-on specification would typically be aircraft range, to be able to fly over to enemy territory, observe the area, and then return and report their findings. On this requested design, the primary focus would be in making the plane compact and light. This search for a new design led to an incredibly basic design from Yokosuka in the E14Y, a single-engine monoplane seaplane with very low performance. Measuring just 8.54 meters long, 11 meters wide, and 3.82 meters tall, the wood and fabric plane had a gross weight of just 3,197 pounds. Powered by a single Hitachi Tempu 12 with just 340 horsepower, the top speed of the E14Y was just 153 miles an hour. With its very small frame and weight-saving overall, the range of the plane was also quite short as well, just 548 miles. Armed with a single rear-facing 7.7mm machine gun, the E14Y could also carry just two 168-pound bombs under fuselage. Clearly, the focus was never to be offense, as there would only be one plane per submarine, and the armament it had seemed to be kind of ceremonial in nature. They had it just because that's what planes have. The more important element of the plane was the fact that it could be disassembled into 12 or so parts, like the wings, tail fins, pontoons, pontoon supports, etc., meaning that it could be stored more easily on a watertight container that was attached to the Japanese subs. When the submarine was brought to the surface, it would take a handful of crew members roughly 15 minutes to reconstruct the plane, and from there the plane would be launched from a catapult on the submarine deck. Presumably on the return trip, the plane would land on the water, sort of drive over to the sub, and then would be dismantled and stored by the same crew in roughly the same amount of time. Ultimately, for the E14Y as a recon plane, its career was largely quiet and lacking major note apart from two events. While its standard, more bland career involved flying recon flights over Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and more, it would perform a flight over Pearl Harbor just 10 days after the initial Japanese attack to survey the damage done. A pretty standard mission overall, just attached to a far greater event. The other more interesting thing this plane did was in 1942. A single E-14Y would be loaded up with firebombs and would fly over the mainland United States and over Oregon specifically. It would drop these bombs over a forest, which then led to a small forest fire, and, well, that was it. I guess it was just largely to annoy the American government and scare the American people. But they did it. They dropped some bombs in an Oregon forest, so they did that, I guess. But also around the time the E-14Y would embark on its first recon mission over Pearl Harbor, the planner of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Isoroku Yamamoto, would propose a new class of submarine, in the I-400 class, far larger than anything seen before, and so large that it wouldn't be until the construction of nuclear submarines that something surpassed it in size. Effectively, these massive submarines were to be used almost like mosquitoes buzzing around the coast of the United States. With their impressive size, they would be able to initially house 2 aircraft instead of just 1, and instead of them being recon planes, they would be actual attack aircraft. These planes, being that they would be small in number, would be used for small-scale attacks against factories and population centers, interrupting production or causing panic among the general populace. Sort of like how the E-14Y would bomb Oregon to probably scare the American people, these new subs and the planes on them would do that, but several times over and far more often. With 18 of these subs proposed to be built, if all of them were active at the same time, that was 36 planes that could be sort of pecking along the American coastline. Certainly not a war-winning maneuver or majorly damaging, but still a great way to reduce American morale and force the American military to devote more resources to homeland defense. So for these new submarines, another new plane was requested. But instead of just a basic sort of nothing plane, an actual high-speed, high-performing combat aircraft was needed. For this new plane, the company Aichi would be issued Specification 17-SHE, which called for a single-engine attack aircraft that needed a top speed upwards of 345 miles an hour, the ability to carry 1,874 pounds of explosives, and it needed a range up to 800 nautical miles, or around 920 miles. Strangely enough, the plane initially was not to have any kind of undercarriage, no wheels, no pontoons, so presumably once its mission was completed, the pilot would just bail out and the plane would be lost. But rather quickly though, as Japan was not in a dire state at this stage of the war, the design request would quickly be revised to include a pair of pontoons that would allow the plane to land and then be recovered. With the full requested specs in hand, Aichi could proceed with the designing and construction of the first prototypes, and while this process was slow, it proceeded smoothly. By October or November 1943, the first AM-24, as Aichi called it, or M6A, as the Navy called it, was completed and ready to fly. Measuring in at 11.64 meters long, 12.26 meters wide, and 4.58 meters tall, the M6A was a good deal larger than the E-14Y, being larger in every possible direction. The M6A was also powered by a much stronger engine, and an uncommon one at that for the Japanese Navy, in that it was an inline liquid-cooled Aichi Atsuta, a licensed version of the German DB601. Presumably, this type of engine was selected for better aerodynamics and thus hopefully a higher top speed. With a gross weight of 8,907 pounds, the M6A was nearly 3 times the weight of the E14Y. But for an actual attack aircraft that was to have higher performance, this weight gain was inevitable. With its stronger engine, the overall armament was to be much greater as well. Armed with just a single 13mm machine gun, the true focus was the payload, as it was to be an overall dive and torpedo bomber, and it could carry upwards of 1,874 pounds of explosives. As it was to be a surprise attack plane, this presumably made the gun armament far less important. It ideally wouldn't be seeing enemy aircraft, as they wouldn't have the time to scramble their defensive fighters before the M6A arrived and attacked. With the overall increase in size, weight, and armament, there would also be an increase in the top speed, although that top speed they hit was not as high as they wanted it to be, likely because of the addition of the pontoons adding weight and drag. The top speed of the M6A was 295 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour below the original request. However, it is also possible that the pontoons could have been ejected mid-flight, increasing performance in a pinch, but it is also possible that this was never the case and was just a rumor. But for probably the most important aspect of the plane, we have the storage and transportation of it. And like the E14Y, the M6A would have to fit within very narrow and cramped waterproof hangars. Unlike the E14Y though, aside from the pontoons on it, the M6A would actually remain in one piece, likely due to having increased performance, meaning that there were greater forces exerted on the surfaces, so having fully detachable surfaces probably wasn't the best idea. Instead, the wings would fold in to be parallel to the body, not too dissimilar from Grumman's stow wing design. In addition, the tail surfaces would also fold. The horizontal surfaces would fold down at the root, so the wings could fit as close to the body as possible, while the vertical surface would only have the tip of it fold so that it fit in the hangar. There was also another neat little feature, if you want to call it that, in that around where these surfaces folded, they were painted with phosphorus or glow-in-the-dark paint, so if they had to assemble the plane at night, they could see where they had to work. In all likelihood, the planes would be launched almost exclusively at night under the cover of darkness, just for the additional cover it provided and the added surprise of the attack happening at night. So when the M6A first took to the air in November 1943, its flight and subsequent test flights into 1944 that was joined by further prototypes were reportedly a major success. While I couldn't find exact details of the prototype performance, it was successful enough that before every prototype had been completed and sent over to the Navy for testing, and there were 8 prototypes in total, the Navy would order Aichi to begin full-scale production. It wouldn't be until the spring of 1944 that this full-scale production actually began, though, as Aichi at the time lacked enough of the Atsuta engines they intended to use, so they would have to do some intermediate testing with less powerful versions of that very engine. All the while this was going on, and the M6A was going through designing and testing and its eventual production, the I-400 submarine plan had been altered significantly due to the changing war situation and also changes to the Navy leadership. In a very much unwilling change in leadership, The mastermind of the I-400 class, Isoroku Yamamoto, would be killed in 1943, leaving the class without its father figure. Making matters far worse, though, was the fact that by 1943, the military situation Japan found themselves in was less than ideal, and as a result, the Navy now could not afford the luxury of making 18 massive submarine aircraft carriers, and instead they had to focus on making smaller, more common and practical submarines. Thus, the original plan for 18 submarines was reduced down to just 5, and of these 5, just 3 of them were actually made. These were I-400 and I-401, both functional combat vessels, and I-402, a submarine tanker. With this reduction, though, it was also worked into the design some space for an extra aircraft, so each sub would carry 3 planes instead of 2. This reduction in the number of submarines ended up being quite fitting for the M6A project, though, as very few of them ended up being produced as well. While production began in early 1944, that production was rather slow overall, and then in December 1944, an earthquake would rock the factory that was making the M6A, which just about ended production of that plane then and there. That factory would then receive the effective death blow through some Allied bomber attacks, and overall just 18 production model M6As would ever be made. In addition, there were 2 land-based trainers in the M6A1K, so total there were 8 prototypes, 2 trainers, and 18 production planes. A grand total of just 28 M6As were made. Even with this very tiny production run, the M6A would actually embark on a combat mission, and there was another combat mission that was planned. The initially planned combat mission would be one that would disrupt American supply lines severely, and it was an attack on the Panama Canal. Ideally, roughly 10 M6As would be sent over on several submarines to attack the Gatun locks that make up the canal, destroying them and thus preventing any ships from passing through. This plan, though, would never come to fruition, and instead a different plan to destroy an American fleet that was based at the Ulithi Atoll located between Palau and Guam in a kamikaze attack was formulated. 2 of the I-400 class subs, I-400 and I-401, would embark with 6 total M6As, and they would be followed by a pair of smaller submarines that were carrying 4 total Nakajima C6 and Recon planes. This group of subs would set sail in late July 1945. As they approached their target by mid-August, they were then radioed and informed that the war was over and Japan had surrendered. Both subs then proceeded to take their M6As and throw them into the sea to prevent them from being captured. So ultimately, what could have been the sneakiest attack plane of World War II only ended up perhaps surprising some fish and maybe a few crabs at the bottom of the sea. What could have been a rather interesting aircraft and also attack method was reduced down to absolutely nothing. Which does bring up the question of what America would have done if these planes actually made it into combat. America was already defending the coastline, as evident by the kerfuffle that was the Battle of Los Angeles, but I would assume that having the constant threat of these planes attacking would lead to further defenses being built, taking up time, resources, and manpower in the process. While it certainly wouldn't have made a dent in the overall American war machine, it still would have at least been a hindrance, an annoyance that sort of had to be dealt with. So I guess ultimately, at its best, the M6A project would have been annoying, and realistically, it probably was just overall a waste of time. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. To be honest, when I read about how the planes were catapulted into the air, I don't picture an actual aircraft catapult system, nor do I picture an actual catapult. Instead, for whatever reason, I imagine a trebuchet. I sort of imagine these planes attached to a rope, just being flung into the sky, or more accurately in the M6A's case, just into the sea, which I feel like would also be much more interesting and a lot funnier. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.